Today's agenda is what do we want to have an approval for? In this particular example, we're going to do a transaction entry for accounts payable. To do that, we're going to talk about the role of the manager, what the approval rules are, and what happens if I'm away. I can have workflows for a lot of things in Dynamics GP now. As of the October 2019 release, you can have work for approval for new GL accounts, general ledger batches, receivables batches, sales transaction entry, payables batches, payable transactions, purchase orders, purchase requisitions, purchasing invoices, receiving transaction entry, vendors, smart list designers, users, security roles, security tasks. You can even now import and export workflows, and you can change the approver for active workflow tasks. It should be noted, however, that payables batches and payable transactions cannot both currently have workflows against them. Consider this restriction as you design the rules for your workflow. As you design your workflow, the first thing you have to consider is the role of the workflow manager. The workflow manager, along with the system administrator and any power users, will be able to create and configure workflows for the type of workflow that you're working on. The workflow manager is also the fail-safe approver for when a workflow does not meet any conditions and is required to be approved by somebody. Once your manager is determined, the next step is to determine the workflow rules. The approval steps, or rules, for the workflow can be as simple or as complicated as you want them to be. You have to ensure, however, that the approval step is based on a field that is available to the workflow. Inside the Workflow Condition Editor, check the checkbox Display Extended Field List. This will ensure that all of the fields available to this workflow step will be shown in the drop-down list for Select a Field. Once the approval steps have been determined, you next have to ask yourself what happens if the approver does not reply. What is the time limit for the approver to reply? Should a reminder be sent to the approver? If no reply is ultimately received, what should happen next? Should no action be taken, the approver still gets to approve? Do you escalate to the next approver? Do you name a secondary approver? Do you automatically reject the task being considered? The next consideration for the workflow rules is what happens if the approvers are a group of people? What is the completion policy? Should only one of the approvers approve? Should the majority of the approvers approve? Or do all of the approvers have to approve? The last consideration for workflow setup is what if your workflow approver is away? Do they just sit and wait for the approver's return? From user preferences, you can select a delegate for your workflows. This can be done on your behalf in the case of illness by another Great Plains user. When your workflow is complete, check the active checkbox on the workflow maintenance screen. This will make the workflow available to your test company for testing or your live company for actual use. Time for a demonstration. Let's head over to D365. Alright, over in Great Plains now, we're going to go into our administration homepage, into company setup, workflow, and workflow maintenance. I'll start by showing you the different modules where we can see financial. We have general ledgers and batches. In sales, we've got receivables batches, sales transaction approvals. In purchasing, we've got payables batches, payables transactions, purchase orders, requisitions, purchasing invoices, receiving transactions, vendor approvals. Over in US payroll, various things that don't really apply to us Canadians. In project accounting, you can do expense report approvals, timesheet approvals, and in administration, we've got Smart List Designer. My version of GP is a little older, so I don't see the new features for the various security settings. So I'm going to start at the top of the payables transaction approval, and I can see that I've set Paul Johnson as the manager for this approval. You'll remember from the PowerPoint slides that the manager has the ultimate responsibility if there is no path for the transaction to get approved. Then the manager is going to be the one that will be responsible for approval. Moving into the workflow now, this is where we can see the approval step. We'll look at that next. Under the options, this is where we can say we want to send notifications for completed transactions. And if we go to the detail window, we can then see what various tasks we could assign to let the originator know what's happening with their workflow. We can allow the approver to delegate tasks. We can allow the originator of the transaction to be an approver. We can always require at least one approver, or we can change the alternate final approver. If a task is overdue, we can determine what should happen. If I take no action, then the workflow continues to remain waiting for approval. I can escalate to the next approver if I set that up inside the steps. I can escalate to a different approver, or I can automatically reject the transaction if the workflow becomes overdue. Moving to the approval step, this is where we set the criteria for what the transaction should look like in order to get approved. We'll look at that step next. Once the approval step is determined, at the bottom of the screen we say who we're assigning the approval to. We set their time limit, and we tell the system to use the workflow calendar, so we're not asking for weekends, or if the workflow calendar calls for it, we are using weekends. We can set a reminder email to the approver. We identify which message we should send, and if there's any documents attached to the transaction, such as if you've scanned the email through the AP transaction window, that will go to the approver as well. On the completion policy, we can say if one response is needed, or if there's more than one approver, we can say if the majority must approve or if all must approve. Moving into the condition editor, this is where we actually set the condition for the workflow to match in order to determine who should be the approver. So here, my PM transaction work document amount, so the invoice total, is greater than and includes, which is Microsoft speak for equal to, 1,000, which would be $1,000 in this case, as that's my functional currency. If I click on the Display Extended Field list and then use the Select a Field drop-down, you can see all the different fields that are available to the workflow when trying to make the evaluation for who should be the approver. You can make these as complicated or as simple as you want them to be. I'm going to mark our workflow as active, save the workflow, and then head over to Accounts Payable. I'm going to key an invoice into the system. And we're going to select the A Travel Company. And we're going to charge $100,000. We spent a lot of money on travel recently. And I'm going to submit this transaction into the workflow. The system warns me that I've got purchase orders for this vendor. I know that, but this is a non-purchase order transaction, so I'm going to continue. I'm going to say this is a lot of travel. Please approve anyway. So after submission, you can see on the transaction that the approval is pending. Approval by Paul. Paul has until April 24th, 2020 to reply to this. And if I switch to my payables transaction, transactions pending approval view, I can again see that my transaction is sitting here waiting for Paul to approve it. Summing up the webinar today, we've looked at the different workflows that are available in Dynamics GP's October 2019 release. And over in the demo, we created a workflow for an accounts payable transaction entry.